It will be interesting to see what comes out as a commodity. I think we all agree with regards to Bitcoin that it passes the Howey test or fails. I'm never sure to. You know what I'm asking?
Yes, I guess Bitcoin passes the Howey test in the sense that it's not a security.
Yeah.
If that's the way we're going to define it. But the Howey test, just to be for people who don't know, I mean, and many of your followers will know, but the Howey test it was a Supreme Court case from 1934, if I recall correctly, about orange groves, and that basically that ruling for the Supreme Court, which was I think a 5-4 ruling. It may have been 6-3, but it wasn't a unanimous ruling. But it was like basically that kind of a law of unintended consequences became the defining legal framework for what is a security and what isn't. It defines the SEC's authority because the Securities and Exchange Commission was created by the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933. And so basically all the law around what is a security and what isn't, the SEC would claim is defined by that Supreme Court case. But the Supreme Court case is kind of vague and not really well written in that sense. And so it's been really tough for the Bitcoin/digital asset world to navigate that. And I think this bill will really sort of nail it down and say, okay, Bitcoin is not a security. Bitcoin spot market will be regulated by the CFTC. And that then allows for so many more products. There could be a real explosion of opportunities for people who want to start new businesses.
And I think Ethereum, they would make a good argument that it also passes the Howey test. It isn't a security. It was discussed before a couple of years ago, where it's kind of the belief that it may have been a security, but it isn't now. I'm not sure where it will really go with a lot of these other shitcoins. I'm not a fan of them. I'm not a fan of the rug pulls. I'm not a fan of the unknown information. And it's going to put a lot of these projects in the future in a position where they're going to have to provide a lot of clarity. Some people are obviously very against growth of the state and anti-regulation. I do think there will be some regulatory protection to investors around some of these shitcoins, basically.
Yeah, I think this is an important and I think underappreciated element of the regulatory trajectory, which is that Bitcoin is pretty clearly not a security, not merely because the government has said so on many occasions, and this bill does as well, but just again by the Howey test and some of these legal traditions in the U.S., there is no management. There is no, it just doesn't meet the test. Very clearly, doesn't meet the test of a security. Ether is a bit of a middle case, as you alluded to, but Bitcoin clearly is not a security, and so all these different crypto projects, which get buzz because people sort of look at that and say, well, I can make 1,000x my money on random crypto shitcoin, but I don't know if I'll make 1,000x my money on Bitcoin. And so they all kind of gravitate there. It's more speculatively interesting. But the problem is there's a lot of downside, not just in the price of those assets, but also in the regulatory landscape for those assets, because they are going to get regulated in most cases as securities. And that is going to really limit their upside relative to something like Bitcoin which is obviously and is trying to be the hardest money ever built.
Does that put some of the exchanges in a difficult position? Because we'll give a pass to Bitcoin and Ethereum just for now. If these are securities, does that mean people involved in the projects have to register them as securities? Or if they want to launch one, they have to launch them as a security, and therefore every exchange will essentially only be able to list those that are a registered security?
Well, it'll be a mix. So there will be some that will be defined as the law, the bill, the Lummis-Gillibrand bill, which I think is called the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. That bill actually says there's going to be basically three classes.
Okay.
Class number one is a security, defined as such by basically the Howey test. They basically codify into congressionally legislated action statute what a security is. Then there's this sort of middle group, which they call ancillary assets. And a lot of crypto would fall under the bill under ancillary assets, meaning they're not exactly securities like the way a stock, like Apple stock is a security or a bond is a security, because you have this thing, it is actively managed by some group of people at a corporation, but because you have no ownership share in the crypto project, it's not actually a security. The way it is, if you buy Apple stock, you have an ownership share, however small, in Apple, the company. That isn't necessarily true with a lot of these crypto projects, right? You don't actually have an ownership share. So there's a kind of a list of definitions of things that if you don't pass this test, you're not a security, you're called an ancillary asset, which would also be under the bill regulated by the CFTC, not the SEC, but would be required to have a lot of disclosures around your risk factors and who's behind it and what assets you hold. And you'd have to have rules around what happens if you go bankrupt and how you dispose of your assets. So there would be a lot of regulation around those ancillary assets, which would encompass a good chunk of crypto, that would effectively could protect consumers a lot in the sense of saying there would be this legal document like there is with an IPO. If there's an IPO today of a normal stock, then there's this long document called an S-1 that the company has to file with the Securities and Exchange Commission that lists all the risk factors that the legal department can conceivably come up with as to why you might lose money in this investment. And I think that's a good rule. It creates confidence in the market because you've got that to look at. If they misrepresent something in that legal disclosure, you can be sued. That's why it has the power that it has, that they actually have to do it the right way. So all that to say that a lot of these projects are going to get heavily regulated, whether they're securities or ancillary assets. They're going to be regulated. They're going to be required to disclose their risk factors. They're going to have a kind of a bankruptcy plan. And that's going to mean that there's a lot more maturity in that market for good. I think it means that the best projects, the projects that actually have merit, that aren't shit coins or at least have some sort of financial utility to them, will continue to succeed. And the ones that are just get rich quick schemes or rug pulls will have a harder time.
So either way, it's really a boom for Bitcoin because the regulatory clarity for Bitcoin makes it easy for people to invest in it.
Yep.
And the rules regarding whether something's a security is probably going to limit the amount of projects that are available to invest in. If this we'll talk about the process for passing, but if the legislation passes, what kind of period of time would exchanges have to respond to this? I mean, if it's codified into law and Bitcoin is regulated by the CFTC, do they have a period of grace? Is there a period of time we're figuring out what regulation for exchanges? How does that all work?
So during the legislative process, they are free, like anyone is, to speak out about their position. So Coinbase or Kraken can say, hey, here's what we think about the bill. They can go directly. They can call up or meet with Senator Lummis and actually tell her directly, or Senator Gillibrand or any other senator who's thinking about voting for the bill, whether they support it or not, because the bill actually has to be introduced. It's been introduced into Congress formally. That's what they did today as we're recording this podcast. But then in order for it to actually pass Congress, the Senate Majority Leader would have to actually say, okay, we're going to have a vote on this bill. And then it would have to overcome a filibuster, meaning at least 60 people would have to vote in the Senate out of 100 to move, close debate, and then have a final vote. And then a majority, 50 plus the vice president at minimum, would have to support the bill. And then it would also have to pass the House, and then it would have to also be signed by the president. So a lot of steps to go through just to get it passed. And through all that process, these various stakeholders or interests can voice their position. In fact, Senator Lummis's office released a 6-page document that had a bunch of quotes from a lot of the trade associations, like the Chamber of Digital Commerce, et cetera, and Kraken and Coinbase and FTX and some others expressing their general support for the bill, or at least the process behind it. So all that is out there.
How long would that all take, usually?
It could take years. It could take months. It all depends really on whether the Senate Majority Leader wants to put it forward. And I would say we just don't know right now. I think if there's a lot of support, if like there are 70 or 80 senators who say this bill is awesome, I'm all for it, let's do this, then it could pass in the next several months. But the more likely scenario is that people are going to study it, they're going to think about it, they're not going to see any urgency to do anything about it, and it's going to really fall to the next Congress, meaning after the midterm elections in 2022, the following Congress comes in January 3rd of 2023, and it may be in the following year where they try to push it. Or it could be that this thing just kind of dangles and just kind of sits there and lingers for a long time without it getting the majority support. So it all depends on how many senators support it. And obviously it would be up to, if the Bitcoin community decides it's something they want to support, then they would need to make that point known to their members of Congress. But all that to say that there's no guaranteed timeline. It's not like if 2 senators introduce a bill, then it gets voted on a month after that or 60 days after that or whatever. It could never pass Congress. It could pass Congress 5 years from now. It could pass Congress in a month. It all depends on that group of senators all deciding what they want to do. And then after the bill passes, then the regulators come in. So then the CFTC, now that it has this new authority, would then have to issue regulations, say, okay, here's how you would implement this law. The SEC would have to do the same on their end, and the Treasury Department, et cetera. So then those regulations come out, what are typically called interim regulations, and then people comment. They have a certain amount of time to comment on those regulations formally through a website that the government puts out, and then the relevant agency reviews those comments, decides whether to take into account or not, and then based on that, they revise the regulations or keep them the same. And they're required by law to do that. If they don't honor that process, you can sue the government and say, hey, you passed this regulation without having this process of notice and comment. And if you don't do that, then the courts could throw out the regulation. And that does happen from time to time.
Does it help that it's a bipartisan bill, or is that quite a regular thing? Because I don't feel like I've seen anything that feels bipartisan for a long time.
There are a lot of bipartisan bills that pass Congress that you just never hear about because the media is never going to cover the stuff that's not controversial. They're only going to cover the stuff where one side or the other, hates it. So that's part of it. And I think this is an unusual case where it's a bipartisan bill that there's a community like ours that really is very interested in it. So it's going to get more coverage. But having said that, I am very encouraged by the fact that, at least in the interviews I've seen of Senator Gillibrand, she has as much ownership and endorsement and support of the bill's contents as Lummis does, and that's important because we've talked about this before. There's a real risk that that Bitcoin becomes more of a partisan issue because that's just the nature of the U.S. political system. Things become tribal and become more polarized, and it's important that it not be that way because Bitcoin is something that can improve the lives of everyone, and we don't want it to be seen, at least I don't want it to be seen as an issue that where only one side thinks that it's good for them.